Elden Ring, the breakout sensation of an entire generation that took a studio from a hardcore cult following to the mainstream. But what if I told you that a game about mysterious monsters and deranged and convoluted characters was hiding even more demented, outrageous, and unbelievable secrets?
Soon birth thee anew, a sweeting, fresh and pure. Upon my name is Rani the Witch.
Man kneel. I am the Lord of all that is golden.
Send word far and wide.
For those that don't know, an iceberg is a deep dive into the strangest and most disturbing ideas in our favorite worlds. The ideas that make us cry, the ideas that make us sing, and the ideas that light the fire within our soul to know what's out there. And you see, my icebergs are a little different. I'm not just going to go down and read off a pre-made list, but instead, I have my own curated one, full of interesting theories, lore tidbits, quests, and just cool things I've found around the game. Buckle up. Everyone's favorite spectral steed torrent is shrouded in a lot of mystery. Many online have even speculated that this majestic creature only got its name from Fromsoft, the creators of Elden Ring, because they wanted to stop anyone from being able to torrent the game illegally, thus making pictures of this good boy pop up instead when searching Elden Ring torrent on Google. But whether or not this is the case, he's the first character we actually meet in-game, and shortly thereafter we are bestowed with him by Melina, who tells us that we have been chosen by torrent. But this starts to make us ask a lot of questions, like who exactly even is torrent? We know just after receiving the steed whistle from Melina, we can go see Rani, who at the time calls herself Rena, who will give you a spirit calling bell, which allows us to summon spirits to help fight boss battles with us. Rani mentions that she got this bell from Torrent's previous master. So could Torrent be one of these spirits? Well, it doesn't quite seem like this is the case, because Torrent can be summoned anywhere, rather than just next to summoning stones like the other summoning bell spirits. Putting aside theories that Rani and Melina are the same person, something we'll touch on later in this list, could either of them hold the key to who Torrent really is? Maybe Torrent was the old steed of Rani's previous master, who she killed in the Night of the Black Knives, something else we'll also talk about later on this list. Or maybe Torrent's master was actually Sheloa's steed, from the ancient sea turtle spirit we see later on in Rani's questline. But most importantly of all, Torrent's real connection may lie with my personal favorite boss in all of Elden Ring, the Ancestral Spirit. If we read the Remembrance of the Regal Ancestor game entry, we find out that the ancestral spirits and beings of the Shofra River are actually living between life and death itself, outside of the realm of the Erd Tree above. In the spectral steed whistle description we get for Torrent from Melina, we notice that it mentions that Torrent does die, which is extremely significant because all other beings in the lands between don't actually die. Some crazier lore we'll dive into deeper on this list. The only place we see this otherwise is the ancestral spirits. And even more crazy is the fact that the jump and sound animation for the ancestral spirit boss and Torrent are exactly the same. So could Torrent be a descendant of the ancient ancestral spirits of life and death itself, set forth on a mission to bring the chosen tarnished, you, to bring down the great reign of the greater will? It would explain why Melina and Rani describe Torrent as if he has his own volition and free will, and also explains how Torrent knows so much and is so helpful on your journey. Either way though, regardless of who or what Torrent is, he plays a much bigger part in Elden Ring's story than most people realize. Anyone that has played Elden Ring surely at some point has come across the infamous message, "Try fingers, butthole." For those that don't know, these messages are created by other players who use a tarnished, wizened finger to leave a message for other players to eventually find at the same spot in their travels. These messages are meant to help others figure out puzzles, battles, or just give heads up to upcoming danger. But Fromsoft was smart and made it so players can only create messages from pre-selected templates. That way things wouldn't get out of hand. Or so they thought. Because immediately upon release, gamers did what gamers do best and created the meme we all know and love today, leaving the lands of Elden Ring now littered with the same message everywhere. What a lot of players don't know, though, is the crazy and disturbing backstory behind how this message first got started. You see, the original creator of the message was unknown for months after release. However, it was recently discovered that the message actually was first created in a select few players' games by one Fromsoft admin. As fans started to wonder why this was, one user in the forums discovered that the specific admin in question was actually part of a satanic worshipping cult based out of Wyoming called the Fingers. The cult had months after the game's release been raided by the FBI based on charges of kidnappings, where the cult members would stick their fingers in the victim's I'm just messing with you guys. Throughout the lands between, we find many so-called finger maidens, who through the guidance of the two fingers, who serve the greater will, lead many great warriors and tarnish through their grace to the championing of the Elden Ring. But in the start of the game, you may have noticed a dead maiden sitting against a wall in a pool of blood in the church that we start in. We know this lady is a maiden because we are able to use her blood to soak Mog, Lord of Blood's favor in game, which is only activated with a maiden's blood, per the item description. So the question then becomes, what is this maiden doing here? And as we are reminded by multiple characters throughout the game, we are maidenless. So could this maiden potentially have been our guide that was killed right before the beginning of the game? There are endless theories as to who could have killed our maiden, including some of the demigods trying to remove your guide, or the scion just outside the church being the culprit. But for me, one of the most interesting has to be White Mask Vare, that annoying degenerate we meet when first stepping into the world. Without you even telling him, Vare is immediately aware of the fact that you have no maiden, and he makes fun of you for it, relentlessly. But even more damning, if you zoom in on his hands when we first meet him, they are covered in blood. Could it be that White Mask Vare murdered your maiden just before the game began, and now knowing where you will eventually come, is waiting for you to greet you and act as if nothing happened? The curiosity then would become his motive. After all, any good murder needs one. Well, as we know from discussions with Vare later in the game, he wants you to join the order he is a part of, the Knights of the Modwin dynasty. And in order to do that, he claims a member must kill their maiden, but that any maiden will do and suffice. So did Mare murder your maiden in order to grant himself access to this dynasty? And if he did, what other forces are at play? Could Melina somehow be involved? After all, if this was your maiden that was killed, Melina is the one who mysteriously comes to your rescue and acts as your maiden for the rest of the game. Whether or not Vare is the true killer, or if it really is your maiden, it seems to be heavily implied throughout the game that something more sinister is going on behind Melina, Vare, and the convoluted start to the game. For any new Souls players in the series, finding hidden messages from other players throughout the world would have started as a relief, until you realized in many cases these messages left by other players were pranks more often than not. Many times asking players to jump, roll, hit, and do other things that would result in their death, or even worse, them feeling stupid. All so the community can get a good laugh. But sometimes messages like this can result in finding hidden rooms and treasure. And because of the propensity of Fromsoft to include hidden mechanics like this in their games, some players try anything to find new locations. This was taken to a whole new level though, when it was discovered that there is a wall in Volcano Manor that if hit 50 times consecutively would suddenly disappear, letting players into a room they would already have had access to from another door just on the left. But it still sent the community into an absolute frenzy. After all, now there was definitive proof that these ultra-secret doors did in fact exist in-game. To this day, many players are still hitting walls all across the lands between, in an attempt to find the next big hidden secret. And knowing Fromsoft, there might just be some massive discoveries yet to be made. It's one of the most fun parts of Fromsoft games that really lends to a strong sense of community as the player base bands together to find these new discoveries, and I really wish more games had things like this. The Shattering is quite possibly the most important moment in all of Elden Ring that kicks off the main thrust of the entire story and journey that we go on. But to better understand this momentous event in the lore, let's take a quick and very general look back at the entire history of the universe as we know it to set some groundwork for this theory and the future ones on this list. And by the way, shout out to YouTuber Vati Vidye, I probably butchered that, for his amazing lore breakdowns, which was my starting point for understanding all of this, along with a lot of other videos and lots of reading the wiki and lore. In Elden Ring, there are many beings of immense and unknowable power called the Outer Gods, who all impose their will somehow in the universe that the story takes place in. But in our case, no god plays a bigger part in the world than the Greater Will. Before the Greater Will even first became a massive player on the planet though, there were separate peoples, religions, and gods that reigned over the entire world. All life on this alien planet was said to have begun from an aspect of the primordial crucible, which was a giant tree in the center of the land which birthed life as we know it from its celestial stew. In fact, we even still have some creatures that stemmed from these times, like the Crucible Knights. God, I hate those things. And what is most likely, and something we'll dive into deeper on this list, is that the Greater Will at one point must have had a motive to gain some of this power from the primordial crucible. And that is probably why he sent a giant gold star hurtling towards the planet, bearing an Elden Beast, the same beast we fight as the final boss in the game. In fact, if we read the boss's remembrance after we kill it, it's referred to as a vassal for the Greater Will, otherwise known as someone who holds land on behalf of their ruler. The beast was a living incarnation of the Greater Will's desire for order, and from this desire became the Elden Ring itself, made up of multiple great and minor runes of power, the same runes we can activate to give ourselves buffs after killing great gods and demigods in the game. But the Greater Will needed more than just a giant beast and tree to conquer the lands between, and so it used the two fingers as a way to spread its power and message throughout the land with the help of the crones. And even more, the Greater Will needed a god who could lead its power in the land. This god is the one known as Queen Marika the Eternal, a Numen, or character class that hails from a different planet entirely that we can even play as in the game. Marika was chosen by the Two Fingers as an Empyrean, or candidate for godhood, and eventually assumed this role and was given a shadow, or wolf companion, as her aide. In her case, being Malekith, one of the big boss fights in the game. And in other Imperium's cases, for example, like Ranni, having a beast wolf like Blythe. And now with growing power and influence in the land, the Greater Will's servant, Queen Marika, broke a piece of the Elden Ring, known as the Rune of Death, and gave it to Malekith, starting the Golden Order that we hear and see in the game. This stolen rune is also the reason player characters don't die in Elden Ring and instead always respawn, as death itself was stolen from the world. But the Greater Will was not done, and now the Golden Order's main adversary in the lands was the House of the Moon, which consisted of the Carian royal family and the sorcerers of Raya Lucaria, which we visit in-game. And this is where the events of the Shattering begin to unfold. The Golden Order at the time was led by a great and fierce warrior known as Godfrey, husband to Marika, and under Godfrey's command the Golden Order won many battles and claimed the lands of the giants and the dragons. But the House of the Moon was their most difficult adversary, and a warrior named Radagon of the Golden Order was entrusted with leading the battle here. He marched the Golden Armada into the lands of Liurnia again after multiple previously failed invasion attempts. But this time something strange happened. Instead of waging war, Radagon actually did the unthinkable, and fell in love with the opposing general for the House of the Moon, Lady Rennala, who was also a main boss in the game. Together they had 3 children, Ranni, Radahn, and Rykard, and it is Ranni specifically who kicked off the events that thrust the world into a new age.
On a night of wintry fog, the Rune of Death was stolen.
You see, after the Golden Order had conquered all lands in their path, Godfrey, Marika's husband, was banished from the lands along with the Tarnished, who we play as, and stripped of their grace, being forced to endure hardship for some future plan Marika had, presumably, creating strong soldiers to fight a new foe. Marika believed that only through great trial and tribulation could great warriors be born. But just as Godfrey left Marika's side, Radagon too left Rennala's, and instead immediately went back to the Erd Tree to take his spot as Marika's second husband and new king. The division left Liurnia in pieces and caused a civil war between the two sides of the House of the Moon, the Carian royals and the scholars of Rhea Lucaria. In this destruction, Ranni took her chance and stole a fragment of the Rune of Death that Marika had given her shadow Malekith before, and on that same night, the fragment was used to kill a demigod, more specifically, Marika's own son, Godwyn the Golden, who was her first child that she had with Godfrey before banishing him. This was the first time a god had ever been killed, and a first time that any in the land bestowed with grace had died for good, instead of coming back to life, due to the Rune of Death's power to overcome this spell. Shortly after this horrific event, Marika in retaliation smashed the Elden Ring, shattering it into multiple great runes, which is why we can acquire them in-game, and thrust the world into the chaos we know it for today, where the Tarnished are on a quest to claim back the throne. The entire ordeal creates even more questions than it answers, and leads to many theories about what exactly happened on that fateful night, and who is really pulling all the strings. Theories we'll all get into later on this list. For FromSoft veterans, the name Patches probably brings a smile or frown to your face. He is a renowned and recurring trickster character that has appeared in every Souls-like game besides Sekiro, and in each of the games, he is known for deceiving players into their death and misfortune using the allure of a tasty treasure. He actually made his first appearance in FromSoft's Armored Core 4 Answer from 2008, and ever since they have included him in almost everything. In the Souls games, players grew a love-hate relationship for him, as he would try to trick players into dying to steal their things, but if spared, he would also later help the players and provide some of the most useful items in the entire game. In Bloodbourne, he had his potentially most frightening reveal when players found Patches head stitched onto a spider that was once again used to play a prank on the player. And in Elden Ring, Patches even has his own questline which he is involved in, but sadly it's not fully complete, maybe being saved for a future DLC or sequel. But nonetheless, once again, in Elden Ring, Patches is at it again trying to trick players into their death. For most players, Patches will first be found in Murkwater Cave, where he will initially try to kill you, but upon being bested, will ask for you to spare his life. If you do, you will find him in multiple places throughout the world, including the Volcano Manor just outside the main room, and also once again playing a trick on you at Mount Gelmir. For any player that stumbled upon these weird glowing rocks near the edge of the mountain, you may have wondered what these were and if they held a secret. Well, for anyone that missed it, if you actually walk by and investigate each of these rocks by the cliff face, a cutscene will play where Patches comes up behind you and kicks you off a cliff.
Well, if you really are that gullible...
You can hate Patches, but you can't argue he's one of the most memorable FromSoft characters of all time. Every FromSoft game, whether it is Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodbourne, Sekiro, or even Elden Ring, has a hardest boss. And in Elden Ring's case, for almost everyone, this boss is Malenia, Blade of Miquella. She can be found in the Halig tree, which is by far my favorite zone in the game. But don't let its beauty deceive you, because what lives at the end of this massive and sprawling zone is a warrior donning red hair and a glory unlike any other. Daughter of Radagon and Marika, Malenia boasts a massive katana, fast movement, massive AoE attacks, and most annoying, lifesteal on every hit. For many players, this boss proves to be the one that makes them quit the game. But luckily, there is a feature in the game that allows you to have other players join your world for but a moment to join you in battle against great foes. Because of this, many players wait outside of Malenia's boss battle in hopes that they will be called upon by other players to help them wage war against her. But none of these stories tops the one posted by Reddit user U22Zipa. After 20 to 30 Malenia attempts and getting to 15% several times, I finally decided I would try summoning and bum rushing with 2 others and just getting it done. So I popped the finger remedy and approached the first sign I could. It was a man, wearing nothing but a jar in his head, holding 2 katanas named "Let Me Solo Her." I considered against it, but I was curious, and who am I to deny his wish? The man took no damage except for some rot on the flower attack. He was flawless and put all of my attempts to shame. I definitely didn't kill Melania, but either way, she is dead. Thank you, kind stranger, even if you will never see this message. This post was followed up by yet another, but this time by the actual Let Me Solo Her player himself, including a video of him soloing the boss for many different gracious players. He used no overpower abilities, no cheese strategies, and even taunted the boss with emotes as he went on. It was a display of Elden Ring at the highest levels, a man who had dedicated himself to the blade and become so powerful that his only option left was to live on as a legend. And most surprisingly, his character was dressed in nothing but a giant pot for a helmet and 2 swords, with the rest of his body being completely exposed with underwear. Both of these posts absolutely blew up on Reddit, and overnight, the biggest Elden Ring meme was born. And to this day, the legend of Let Me Solo Her carries on, and he still joins games to help other players take down the boss, with many creating fan art and stories around his triumph. The moons in Elden Ring are more than just giant rocks floating through space. They seem to have a will of their own and somewhat impose it upon the world of Elden Ring. Some notable examples of this are Lady Renala's bright moon, from which she harnesses her immense power, Ranni's dark moon we see in her ending, and a hidden black moon that is said to sit above the eternal city of Nokron, my second favorite zone in the entire game. Where this theory starts to get weird though is in the first week of release for Elden Ring. Players who found themselves at the Moonlight Altar, that high rock cliff face in Liurnia you access near the end of Ranni's questline, they noticed 2 giant moons sitting in the sky. But ever since that first week, players have not been able to spot the second moon, instead only seeing 1 hovering above in the night sky. We have multiple recordings from this time period showing that there was in fact at one point 2 moons in the game at this location, but now they've mysteriously disappeared. So the question then becomes, what happened to the other moon, and what are the implications of it suddenly evaporating out of thin air? Potentially these 2 moons were a mistake by Fromsoft that was patched out quickly after release. But the issue with this is that to this day we still see on the clock that there are 2 moons in the cycle, with a full moon surrounded by a crescent moon in the art. Which means it certainly seems like these 2 moons were intentional, which makes the idea that one has never been seen again a haunting thought of some sort of cosmic event going on that we're unaware of. One of the best parts of Elden Ring is defeating a boss or difficult enemy and finding a brand new, undiscovered weapon with an entirely new moveset and set of abilities that can drastically change how you play the game. There's a lot of debate in the community as to what the hardest weapon in the game to actually acquire is, ranging from the Magma Blade, the Envoy's Longhorn, the Halig Tree Great Shield, the Halo Scythe, Fire Monk and Noble Golden Swords, and many more. But for many, one of the most rare and hard to get weapons is actually the Celebrant's Sickle. Found in the windmill village of the Atlas Plateau, the Celebrant's Sickle only has a 0.5% drop chance, meaning 1 in 200 players who even go to this area and fight the right mob have a chance of getting it. It is found on one of only 2 of the demented and crazy residents of the town, the 2 wearing long blue capes, and unless you are extremely lucky, will require that you kill these 2 ladies over and over for hours to even have a chance of the item dropping. Luckily for players that did receive their prize though, the sickle is quick, strong, and extremely fast with potent attacks, and most importantly, makes your character look super badass. As previously mentioned, right before the shattering occurred, Lord Radagon left his current life Renala in Liurnia and returned back to the Erd Tree, where he immediately was taken as Marika's second husband, following her banishing her first, Godfrey, and the Tarnished from grace. But this story only gets more twisted and scary the more we dive into it. You see, if you talk to the giant church turtle, Muriel, Pastor of Vows, he tells how at one point a statue was commissioned that held the secret that Radagon held so close. We can actually find this statue in Lindell Capital, along with some other spots, and if activated, the massive statue of Radagon transforms into Marika? Radagon's massive secret was that he was in fact Marika, or at least they had some sort of connection. The problem is multiple different sources argue different things, with some implying Radagon and Marika were always the same person, like when Enya mentioned that all demigods stem from Queen Marika, which means Radagon having children with Renala must have been Marika the whole time, and others implying they conjoined at some point or have some strange and unknown connection. This has resulted in this plot point being one of the lesser known and most open-ended lore dives in the entire game. It could be that Radagon and Marika simply represent two sides of the same thing, the Greater Will's essence, and Radagon could be the loyal and fierce warrior, while Marika could be the treacherous maiden harboring doubts. This would explain why when Marika breaks the Elden Ring, Radagon then begins trying to fix it after Marika is banished and imprisoned. And this also would explain the ending of Elden Ring, where we open the Erd Tree and come to the final boss expecting Marika, but instead find Radagon, potentially partially infused with her instead. My personal take is maybe as Marika began to harbor doubts about the Greater Will, she banished Godfrey and the Tarnished in order to make them grow strong through great trials, to one day come back and defeat the Greater Will's hold over her, so that she could then turn and fight back. But the Greater Will sensed this fever brewing inside Marika and created a great warrior, Radagon, from her essence, who was then sent to seduce Lady Rennala and cause the downfall of the House of the Moon. This would have given the Greater Will total control of the land, but what the Greater Will didn't expect was that one of Radagon's children, Ranni, would betray her father, and kick off the shattering, which resulted in Marika also breaking the Elden Ring, greatly hurting their Greater Will's plans. Maybe even Ranni and Marika had some sort of plot together, to take hold of the Greater Will's power and drive the divine being from the land, with Ranni entrusting you as the Tarnished with finally slaying the Elden Beast and giving her a right to the throne in her ending, should you choose it. Fromsoft fans are known for being some of the most hardcore and intense, but also loving communities out there. And this was proven in no better place than the story of Stray Demon. Named after one of the big monsters from Dark Souls, Mr. Stray Demon was a fanatic FromSoft fan who would constantly post on Reddit about the upcoming release of Elden Ring. He knew everything there was to know about all the other Souls games, and relished the fact he could bring so much joy to others by talking about lore, making posters, and just generally being a great person to be around and making the community feel special. In a horrific turn of events though, Stray Demon's daily posts about Elden Ring started to slow down as the game's release date got closer, and other fans started to get worried. Multiple posts were made about Stray Demon's disappearance, until it was found out that on his Twitter account he had mentioned some major medical issues he was dealing with just before disappearing. It seemed clear that Stray Demon had sadly passed away just before the release of his most anticipated game ever, and as a tribute, the community created tons of heartfelt messages and social media posts about the man who just loved playing FromSoft games. At the final hour though, just as everyone was in the middle of mourning, Stray Demon returned in a flash of light to let everyone know that he was in fact having very distressing medical conditions, but that he was alive and kicking, and he would be joining everyone in the game within the coming days. He hasn't posted on Reddit since, but I was able to find a very recent post by him on his hidden Twitter account, so he for sure is still alive and kicking, and most assuredly has played Elden Ring. Long live Stray Demon. If you didn't know, the giants in the snowy peaks to the northern half of the Elden Ring map pay tribute to and worship a deity known as the Fell God. That giant red eye we see in the fire giant boss battle in the middle of his body is actually a physical representation and birth to the Fell God itself, who wishes to see all through the bodies of the giants. But even more interestingly, this may actually give us an idea as to why trolls in the game have a giant missing section of their stomachs, something you likely became accustomed to in the early game. From the lore, we know that the trolls are actually long-lost descendants of the giants themselves, and that they at some point did something considered extremely treacherous, and were banished from the lands of the Fell God. Could it be that the giant missing section of each troll's stomach used to be an eye of the Fell God, and that after they betrayed this all-knowing deity, they were forever banished from the land, forced to roam aimlessly, and also forced to mindless servitude pulling caravans all along the world? It would perfectly explain how these massive and powerful beasts have fallen so low on the totem pole. One of the best features that Elden Ring has that differentiates it from other RPGs in the genre is its amazing map. Instead of being full of quest markers and big signs leading the player to exactly where they should go, it's a game of its own, where players can zoom in on interesting land masses and buildings and set forth into the world to find out what's there. Most players though don't know that this map actually also contains a lot of hidden messages and meanings that give insight into a lot of the lore in the game, or at least we think. You see, back when Elden Ring was in beta, there was a map that could be accessed by players that contained some Yi Chinese script that was translated by Chinese speakers in the community that revealed some very interesting things. And while the beta map never made it into the full game, we can still find similar markings all around the main Elden Ring map, signifying that the older scripts were likely canon hints. One of these in the North Sea reads, "Do not listen to the songs of the lying mermaids," when translated, and could be a nod to Greek mythology where sirens would lure sailors to their homes before killing them. Another cool find is a word just beneath a whirlpool in the Elden Ring map, which when translated to text reads, "Multiple witnesses to a sea serpent. Danger." Many of the other markings around the map give names to previously known locations, like Limgrave actually being named the Sea God Continent, and many others have to do with water and the ocean in general, signifying that it may yet play a bigger role in the world of Elden Ring. Maybe a potential underwater DLC where we fight giant sea monsters? A man can dream. The world of Elden Ring is host to a myriad of strange and interesting creatures, all with their own lore and backstory. And at first glance, one of the most mundane versions of this would be the jellyfish, but that's only for players that don't discover the secret behind Aurelia. You see, Aurelia is a spirit summon we can get early on in the game at the Stormhill Shack ruins, where a woman is lying on the ground who offers you this giant jellyfish who can help you in battle. Besides the fact that the jellyfish can come in very clutch in a lot of fights with her ranged attack, the summon is actually hiding a secret sister named Arlette, who you can find near the mountaintops of the giants at the end of the game by the Stargazer ruins. If you summon Ariel next to this lost jellyfish, they will talk to one another and embrace the fact that they have been reunited after all this time and disappear into the stars. The interaction not only unlocks a handy talisman, but also is one of the most hidden and heartwarming moments in the entire game, watching two sister jellyfish reunite with one another after being years apart. Where this theory starts to take a crazy turn though, is that some players have actually found two tombstones in the mountaintop cemetery sitting right next to each other with the same names of Ariel and Arlette, belonging to two children who died early in their lives. This strongly implies that those two original spirit jellyfish are not jellyfish at all, but in fact, children who have passed away and been reincarnated as jellyfish spirits. This opens a new can of worms though, because it begs the question, are all jellyfish in Elden Ring the reincarnated souls of children? And if they are, what is going on here? Is some sort of cosmic horror happening to these children upon death? Or is there a happier tale on the innocent souls of young being spared from the life and death and instead living a peaceful existence? If you haven't caught on already, Fromsoft games, and specifically Elden Ring, is full of a lot of hidden secrets. But what secret would be bigger than an entire ending that only one person has found? You see, there are 6 endings in Elden Ring, all involving different characters and events, but similar in their own way as well. However, right around the release of Elden Ring, YouTuber Garden of Eyes posted a supposed secret 7th ending to the game that players could only unlock by 100% completing absolutely everything the game had to offer. The full video was claimed to include sections of the player character meeting some of the outer gods and the greater will specifically, and merging with them, becoming an all-powerful new god. Sadly though, this video and rumor turned out to be nothing but a prank from a Dark Souls modder. But that doesn't mean they weren't onto something, because even to this day, many fans still believe there actually is a secret hidden ending to Elden Ring, and no one has figured out how to activate it yet. During your adventures gallivanting around Elden Ring, you probably at one point stumbled upon Lindell Capital soldiers mourning the loss of their fallen comrades. It's a sad sight to see and really puts into context the tragic atrocities all this fighting has caused. In a horrifying twist though, something not uncommon for Elden Ring, there's more than meets the eye here. Because if you actually manage to sneak near one of those mourning soldiers without alerting them, you can hear the sounds of crunching bones and snapping limbs, implying that these soldiers are not actually mourning their lost friends, but rather eating from their corpses as a source of food. As to why this Lovecraftian nightmarish horror is occurring, it's hard to say. It could be that the soldiers are starving or simply being controlled by a demonic entity, but either way, it's a terrifying realization that many players probably missed. While we do know that the Elden Beast was originally sent down to the Lands Between from a great star via the Greater Will, we still don't know exactly what the Elden Beast really is. A creature that has constellations and stars etched into its very frame, and a sword imbued with the bodies of the dead. By taking a closer look at this damn beast though, some in the community have come to the interesting conclusion that the Elden Beast may actually be an amoeba, those unicellular organisms we can see under microscopes and study that change shape and move. His body does in fact seem very reminiscent of an amoeba, and even more interestingly, the Elden Beast could also be parasitic, like many other amoebas, as it has come to the lands to conquer and take over on behalf of the Greater Will. It would explain why the Elden Beast looks the way it does, and would give an interesting lore connection as to what's really going on here. While it's still not clear what the Greater Will's real intentions were with coming to the Lands Between originally, our best guess is that it had something to do with the great and ancient tree known as the Primordial Crucible. The Crucible was the birthplace of all life on the planet and holds immense and unknown powers that a god like the Greater Will would certainly be keen on harnessing. So when the Elden Beast was first sent to the Lands Between, one of the original things that presumably happened was the power of this long-lost great tree began to be harnessed. And in the process, the Erd tree we know and see in the game was born, with its giant yellow rays of light signifying the Golden Order. It would then follow that the Erd tree itself is not some sort of new entity or being, but rather a parasite that has taken over the host body of an ancient being and commandeered its power for its own doing. This leads to a lot of interesting lore implications as to what the Erd tree actually really even is, and what significance it holds. As we know, other great trees like Miquella's Halig tree have grown in competition to this new alien force, trying to bring back the ways of the Primordial Crucible. Could it even be possible that the Halig tree is the true reincarnation of the Primordial Crucible itself, fighting its way back into life in opposition to the parasitic Erd tree? The answers still remain unclear, but either way, these great trees are very likely the thing that makes this planet so special in the first place, and why so many outer gods and gods alike have shown a huge interest in something that lies here. The planet itself is hiding a massive secret brought to fruition from these giant trees, and only in time will the Greater Will or some other powerful force finally unhatch their secrets. One of the coolest weapons in the entirety of Elden Ring has to be the Sacred Relic Sword. But the most interesting part about the entire sword might not even be its awesome look or amazing special attack, but rather the item description. Sword wrought from the remains of a god who should have lived a life eternal. Thoughts on what the weapon portends are many and varied. Some consider it the mark of a great sin, or sign of great devastation. Some think of it as the end of an age, while others, the beginning. When we take into consideration that the same sword also looks almost identical to the coiled sword from the Gundyr boss in Dark Souls 3, something pointed out by YouTuber NDMyOnTV, it starts to paint the picture that Elden Ring may actually be the start of something much bigger than itself. As marked in the description, the sword marks the end or beginning of an age, and as the sword is donned from the final boss of Elden Ring, it's a fitting description indeed. But the horrifying realization is that this new age could actually be different from software games. You see, besides the fact that we do see some reoccurring characters like patches in all of the FromSoft games, and the fact that at one point in an interview George R.R. Martin, who helped write Elden Ring, mentioned that the game was a sequel to Dark Souls, it seems that multiple endings from Elden Ring could actually be the start to other games from the FromSoft catalog. For example, the Frenzied Flame ending of Elden Ring could be the catalyst that thrust the world into chaos in Dark Souls, and would explain how the Light of the Bonfires was born. For Bloodbourne, the Lovecraftian nightmare would have been born from the Age of Stars ending, or Ranni's ending, where she defeats the Golden Order and births the world anew. And to top this out, Demon Souls could be the spawn from the Destined Death ending. All of these theories would make so much sense and would tie everything together, as to reasons we see certain characters like Patches in all of the games, because he stems from the original story, the story of Elden Ring, and only through different endings that the player chooses does the world cascade itself into the stories we know and love, like Dark Souls, Demon Souls, and Bloodbourne. In fact, maybe that hidden 7th ending to the game is actually real, and is the prequel to the Armored Core franchise. I swear I'm not high. It's a super interesting idea to think about nonetheless, and makes the dark and twisted lore of all of these series that much more interesting. In many ways, the lands of Elden Ring are nothing more than a resource-rich canvas from which the outer gods are trying to extract essence or power. The Formless Mother craves wounds and flesh rife with blood. Tainted with her kiss is a poisonous and deadly disease. The god of rot has infected Miquella of the Halig tree and caused a rot of death to sweep over the lands, killing anything in its path. The Lord of the Frenzied Flame wants to burn everything on the entire planet and engulf it in a world of flames, all to bring us together as one. And the Greater Will, through its very parasitic nature, has likely transformed great relics of the past like the Crucible into the beacons of the Golden Order like the Erd Tree. We can see this in places like underground tunnels and caverns throughout the game, where many giant tree roots, presumably from the massive Erd Tree above, have found their way deep underground, with many bodies and souls found dead in their branches, as the tree itself is feeding off all life on the planet. Where this theory gets really crazy though, is when we start to realize that everything surrounding the Great Will specifically has something to do with mushrooms or fungi. You see, in real life, many people don't know this, but mushrooms and trees often communicate through the tree roots underground, which send signals between trees and the mushrooms themselves, telling each other of upcoming danger and other information. But you may be wondering where in Elden Ring's case this applies. Well, if you take a look at the two fingers, you may have noticed they have a fleshy exterior, but the dead ones we find near runes actually seem to be made of wood? Why would this be the case? And on top of this, one uncommon form of mushroom called a dead man's finger fungus looks exactly like the two fingers in-game. Is this the inspiration that Fromsoft had when they were designing the two fingers? It certainly seems like it. The reason this is so significant though, is it would perfectly tie into the idea that the Greater Will is a parasite in the world, harnessing everything in its path of its essence. So it could be that through the use of the great trees that have giant roots underground, they communicate with mushrooms, or in our case, the two fingers, to spread their influence. The reason this is so significant though, is it would perfectly tie into the idea of the Greater Will being a parasite in the world, harnessing it for its essence. Through the use of the great trees and through giant roots underground, it communicates with other mushroom beings, or in our case, the two fingers, which are used to spread influence. But it only gets more wild from here, because for those of you that didn't know as well, mushrooms can actually survive in space, which would perfectly fit into the lore of the Greater Will sending a comet hurling through space holding the Elden Beast, as this comet could also have contained the fungi materials that would start to envelop the lands between. Could it be that the Greater Will is really an alien fungi that has come to the land to strip it of all its resources and power? As someone that personally loves sci-fi even more than fantasy, the idea that an ancient and godlike alien race of parasitic fungi have taken over a planet to harness a long-lost secret power sounds amazing, and there actually is a ton of evidence to support this theory potentially having some validity. For example, this would also perfectly explain why Marika shattering the Elden Ring was so bad for the Greater Will, as the death root plague that began to spread from Godwyn's decaying body would have infected and killed nearby fungus and trees as we see in the game. And to tie this all together, we know that the Erd Tree roots deep underground are digesting the bodies of dead and fallen soldiers and beasts, which is exactly what fungi does in our real world, especially during the Carboniferous period, where it broke down bacteria that developed enzymes to spawn the foundation blocks of our very world. We know that mushrooms recycle dead material into fertilizer, which helps establish growth long-term on planets, and we know that the Erd Tree is most likely the evolved form of the Crucible, which by definition is a situation of severe trial, or in which different elements interact, leading to the creation of something new. This perfectly explains the story of Elden Ring and ties together so many of the core themes, characters, and events that it's almost a disservice to yourself to not at least humor this awesome theory in some way. Melina is one of the most mysterious and important characters in all of Elden Ring. We originally see her at the very start of the game with Torrent, where she finds us and tells us that we are destined for a great journey. And throughout our entire time playing the game, she guides us on our path to claiming the Elden Ring, at one point even choosing to sacrifice herself in the Flame of Ruin and the Goblet of the Giants, as a catalyst to burn the Erd Tree to let you inside. But as many players might not know, this is not the only thing that can happen here. If players decide to go for the lore of the Frenzied Flame ending, where you meet with the Three Fingers and brand yourself to become Lord of the Frenzied Flame and take on the Flame of Ruin yourself, Melina will instead leave you and turn against you at the end of the game, where she will suddenly change her appearance to this, something much more sinister. If we zoom in on her eyes, we notice that she is bearing a striking resemblance to Ranni, as pointed out by YouTuber Bandit Games, donning a crow's feet tattoo on her eye, just like Ranni does, which for those of you that don't know, signifies death, and more importantly, bearing a gloomy purple eye, something that sounds eerily familiar to a lot of lore we can read about in item entries in the game about a mysterious figure called the Gloam Eye Queen. You see, the Gloam Eye Queen, or Dusk-Eyed Queen as she is also called, was said to be the bearer of the Rune of Death itself, and led the Godskin Apostles in a venture to kill many great deities. But when Marika stole the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring and gave it to her shadow Malekith, the Gloam Queen herself seemed to have died along with it, implying that the Rune of Death may have been the actual Gloam-Eyed Queen herself. So years later, when Ranni then kicked off the events of the Shattering and stole a fragment of the Rune of Death that caused Deathroot to spread throughout the land through Godwyn, could it be that this event actually birthed Melina, a reincarnation of the Gloam-Eyed Queen herself? We know in Melina's description that she was birthed at the foot of a great tree with her mother lying inside, which seems to be an obvious reference to Marika and the Erd tree most likely. But this is confusing as Marika is the one that stole the Rune of Death in the first place, thus killing the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Where this takes a crazy turn is maybe this description is actually a reference to Ranni, and Ranni is actually Melina. Being birthed from Marika could make sense for Ranni, as she is the daughter of Radagon and Queen Rennala, but remember it is heavily implied in the game that Radagon and Marika are the same person, or at some point joined. So could this mean that Ranni, daughter of Marika through proxy of Radagon, was born near the Great Tree as a vessel for the new Gloam-Eyed Queen of Death, after the banishing of the Rune of Death itself? Could this explain why Ranni and Melina have so many similarities, like being some of the first people we meet, both knowing about Torrent, both helping us on our journey, and both having very similar facial features and matching tattoos? Is Ranni or Melina, or both, the reincarnation of the Queen of Death and Destruction herself, the Gloam-Eyed Queen? This would also perfectly explain why Ranni kicked off the events of the Shattering, as she wanted to bring back destined death to what it once was, and Melina could either be Ranni herself or the actual queen while Ranni is simply serving her. It also explains why in the Lord of the Frenzied Flame ending, where we essentially become an eternal being, Melina now vows to hunt us down, because as the Queen of Death, it is her destiny to now stop us as an eternal being. We can even read in the Deathroot description this paragraph. On the night of the dire plot, the stolen Rune of Death enabled the first death of a demigod. Later, the Rune of Death spread across the lands between through the underground roots of the great tree, sprouting in the form of Deathroot. So it seems as if Melina, Ranni, or both of them if they are the same person indeed, were birthed from the Erd tree as the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and the reason they help us as the Tarnished is they need to set forth the catalyst to burn the tree and once again take over as destined death. An interesting theory, for sure. Based on the last theory about Melina and Ranni being the Gloam-Eyed Queen and Rune of Destined Death itself, it also starts to make us beg the question, what role did Marika play in all of this? You see, we know that after the events of the Shattering kicked off by Ranni, Marika in retaliation broke the Elden Ring into pieces and the runes were scattered throughout the lands between. It's been assumed that Marika did this because she was angry at Ranni's betrayal, or was simply mad at how things were unfolding. But we also know that after this event, Marika was imprisoned with her husband Radagon, instead taking the mantle, and trying to repair the Elden Ring to no avail. Putting aside whether Radagon and Marika are in fact the same person, or just the same essence fused into one being at some point, this seems to point to the idea that Marika was not on the same page as Radagon, who being the main boss of the game proves he is fully loyal to the Greater Will. Could this mean that Marika was actually harboring many doubts as to the Greater Will's real motives? It would explain why she sent Godfrey, her first husband, away from the lands and forced him and the Tarnished to endure hardship to grow strong. It would explain why she broke the Elden Ring, and also why she stole the Rune of Destined Death in the first place. All of these actions could actually be some sort of grand plan by Marika to overthrow the Greater Will in some way, by creating an army of Tarnished warriors who will come back one day to take the Elden Ring and push the Greater Will from the land, all with the help of Ranni and Melina, who through the use of the Rune of Destined Death can wreak great havoc on the world, Could Marika, Ronnie, and Melina all be colluding together to take down the Greater Will, who is being helped by the Elden Beasts, Fingers, and Radagon? In many ways, the idea spawns even more questions than it answers, but it does hit on the point that something very mysterious is happening with Marika, and it almost seems assured that she knows more than we're being led on to believe, likely being involved in some grand plan to potentially become a god herself. Another interesting theory proposed online by one extremely vigilant Reddit user, Le Bonjour, postulates that the entire map of Elden Ring itself is actually the body of Godwyn, the first god ever killed during the events of the Shattering. This sounds crazy at first, but if you look at Godwyn's decaying body in game, and then at the map of Elden Ring, the similarities start to make sense. For example, the Great Volcano of the map is placed directly where Godwyn would have been stabbed by the Godkiller weapon. The Erd Tree lies at his heart, and Liurnia his intestines, and so on and so on. So could it possibly be that the world of Elden Ring is actually directly formed from the body of a now dead god? The more likely theory is that Godwyn's dead body began to form into the world around him as the Deathroot plague from his body began to spread, potentially stealing essence from the lands between and transferring it to the diseased and lifeless body of Godwyn. Either way though, it's crazy to think that Godwyn's literal body upon death somehow directly connected with the world and now in some way is a part of it, either changing the world and its formation or pulling from its essence to create something new. And as always, thanks so much for watching, guys. The support means a ton to me. I put a ton of research, effort, editing, and writing into these videos, so it means a lot that you guys support and watch them all. And as always, if you want to support me more, I stream every weekend. I love talking to you guys kind of live so you guys can see what I'm like there as well. And also, we do have a YouTube membership program. I'd love for you guys to join or check out any of my other social media where I post daily clips all from this YouTube channel and my stream. Thank you guys very much. I'll see you next time.